lesson 5-6% in estimation, you will estimate by using equivalent fractions and percents. You're going to be using compatible numbers to help you make estimations when dealing with percents. Compatible numbers are two numbers that are easy to divide mentally. In our first example, it says estimate percents of numbers. We're going to estimate 19% of 19% of 30. 19% is about 20%, and 20% is 1/5. So we're going to go ahead and write 20% of 30. When you're working on your homework assignment or on your quiz or test on the estimation problems, even though you're doing it mentally, I want to see on your paper what your thinking is. So if this is the problem, 19% of 30, I want to see you write down that you're changing it to 20% of 30, and 20% is the same as 1/5, because remember 20% is 20 out of 100. So 1/5 of 30. 1/5 of 30 is to take 30 and divide it by 5, which is 6. The next one, 25% of 41. This time I would probably just leave the 25% as 25% because that's a nice fraction of 1/4. But I'm going to change the 41 to being 40. If I change 41 to 40, then 1/4 of 40 is easy to do in my head. 1/4 of 40 means 40 divided by 4. 40 divided by 4 is 10. When you're changing your percents or numbers, you want to change it to something close to what you started with. The further away you go, the further away your answer, your estimate is going to be from the actual answer. Next up, 65% of 76. This time I would probably change both of my numbers. 65% is really close to 66 2/3%. 66 2/3% is that common fraction of 2/3. And then 2/3 of 76 isn't very easy to do, but 2/3 of 75 is easy to do. So I'm going to change that to a 75. So 66 2/3% is the same as the fraction 2/3. And then 2/3 of 75. First, I would do 75 divided by 3 to figure out what 1/3 is. So 75 divided by 3, and that's 25. Now, since I want 2/3, I would take 25 then and multiply it by 2. So 2/3 of 75 is 50. Again, we found that by figuring out 1/3, which is dividing by 3, and then taking that answer times 2 since we wanted 2/3. You may want to pause the video and try the next ones on your own. 24%, I'm going to change to 25%. 25% is 1/4. 1/4 of 44 is actually easy to do, so I'm going to go ahead and leave the 44 as it is. 1/4 of 44 means to take 44 and divide it by 4. 44 divided by 4 is 11. Now for 40% of 49, I would leave the 40% as it is, but I would change the 49 to 50, because 40% of 50 is pretty easy to figure out. 40% means 40 out of 100. 40 out of 100 simplifies to being 2/5. So if we want to figure out 2/5 of 50, we're going to first figure out what 1/5 is. 50 divided by 5. That's going to be 10. And then since we want 2/5, we're going to take 10 times 2, and we're going to get 20 as the answer. The last one might be a little bit harder for you to do mentally. if you're not aware that 13% is really close to 12.5%, and 12.5% is 1/8. Since we're doing 1/8, something compatible that's near 65 would be 64. So 1/8 of 64. 1/8 of 64 is 8. Now, another way you could have estimated this one, and it just wouldn't have been quite as good of an estimate, would have been to use 10%. 10% is one that most of you should be able to do in your head. 10% of 65 is dividing 65 by 10, which is 6.5. So 6.5 would be another estimate, but not quite as good as the estimate of 8. Example 4 says about 11% of the population is left-handed. If there are about 13 million people in Illinois, about how many residents of Illinois are left-handed? Well, for the 11%, we're probably going to just change that to an estimate of 10%. 10% of 13 million. 10%, remember, is 1/10. So 1/10 of 13. 1/10 of 13 is about 1.3 million. Well, actually, 1/10 of 13 is 1.3 million, but that's an estimate for this problem because really it was 11%. So about 1.3 million residents. All right, the last type of problem we're going to do is estimate percents. So we're going to start off by writing these as ratios, 8 out of 25. And then we're going to manipulate it or change it a little bit so we can make it into a ratio that's one of those common fractions that we do know the percent equivalent of. So 8 out of 25 isn't very pretty, but 8 out of 25 is very close to 8 out of 24. And 8 out of 24, when you simplify that, that's going to be 1/3, because if you divide the numerator and denominator by 8, you get 1/3. And 1/3 is one of those common percent and fraction equivalents you should know. 1/3 is 33 and 1/3%, or 33.3 repeating percent. So the answer to number 5 is about 33 1/3%. Number 6, 14 out of 25. I would probably change that 14 out of 25 to being 15 out of 25. And if you simplify 15 out of 25 by dividing the numerator and denominator by 5, you'll get 3/5. 3/5 as a percent is the same as 30 out of 50 or 60 out of 100, which means it would be 60%. Next up, 89 out of 121. I would probably take this 89 out of 121 and change it to being about 90 out of 120. 90 out of 120, if you simplify that, 30 goes into the numerator 3 times, it goes into the denominator 4 times. And 3/4 we know is the same thing as 75%. You may want to pause the video and try the next ones on your own. 7 out of 57. This one's maybe a little bit tricky. You might want to think of that as about 7 out of 56. 7 out of 56 isn't quite as common as some of the others, but 7 out of 56 is one you'll come across. 7 goes into 7 once, 7 goes into 56 8 times, so that is the fraction 1/8, which is 12.5%. Next up, 9 out of 25. 9 out of 25, I would probably change that to 10 out of 25 and see what we can do with that. 10/25, if you simplify 10/25, you would divide the numerator and denominator by 5 and you would get 2/5. Well, 2/5 is the same thing as 20/50 or 40/100, which is 40%. And last, 7 out of 79. I would probably change that to being 8 out of 80, because 8 out of 80 simplifies to being 1/10, and 1/10 is 10%, because 1/10 is the same thing as 10 out of 100.